Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week and another episode. Thank you also for listening in general. We are in the midst of the Layoff series, and this is our third episode in the Layoff series. And I am recording after a conversation that I had for our fourth and final episode of the Layoff series, which is for next week. And that episode is amazing, and it's with a guest named Dan Goodman. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you listen to that episode because he brings the heat for us, everybody. I mean, he is the self-proclaimed counter to HR. And so there are a lot of moments in our discussion and in the recording where we don't agree. And I share with him where I disagree with him on his perspective and in terms of where HR sits in a business. So I'm not going to tease the episode too much because it is in a week and you can just listen then, but it's going to be a great episode. I already know. But all of that to say is that for this week's episode within the Layoff series, I want to talk a little bit about what happens if you or someone you know is navigating and really kind of like managing through a layoff or a loss of their job themselves or yourself. And so, we talked a lot with Jenna Dune a couple episodes ago, and then I shared last week a little bit on, what it's like after a layoff and what happens with survivor's guilt and what happens after, someone is laid off and what the company experience is like. So this week we're going to talk about the employee experience. So first and foremost, once you or someone let's just say someone is laid off, there is that initial shock and anger and upset, right? And disbelief that sets in. Now, I will say candidly, I've never been fired. I've never been laid off. However, according to an article that I'm going to share in the show notes, over 40%, which is a statistic that was originally reported on by Forbes, by the way, over 40% of Americans have been laid off at least once in their career. So that's a very significant percentage of people. So even if we think about the number of people listening, many of you would have experienced this at some point in your careers. And so, of course, that initial impact is there. And something that you'll hear from Dan next week is this notion of really standing up for yourself and knowing if or when you're being taken advantage of. Now, obviously, this is an HR podcast. And obviously, I advocate for HR practitioners to be sound professionals and to be supportive and to be on the right side of business operations, right? And to really challenge if something is not being done correctly and to really do the right thing, just fundamentally. That doesn't mean that the wrong thing isn't ever done. Now, of course, sometimes there are HR practitioners who do the wrong thing. And of course, sometimes there are HR practitioners who are asked to do something that is fundamentally the wrong thing to do. So in the event that that is the circumstance, sometimes someone will have to stick up for themselves. They're going to whistle blow potentially if there's, if there are other things going on. And so if you or someone you know is impacted by the loss of a job or a layoff, there should be, some reflection on that experience in the job. And if there is shock, because it wasn't expected, then also that potentially means that there wasn't a whole lot of transparency throughout the experience and throughout the employment experience. Now, of course, immediately, some of the reasonable concerns that come up are what happens to my healthcare and my benefits? What happens with my final pay? What happens with things that I might have in an office, right? What happens with my equipment? What happened? Like, can I say bye to everyone? Especially if it's like a same day termination. There are questions about severance and separation agreements and employment verification and new jobs and references. Like there's so much that comes up within that first, moment when someone is notified of the end of their employment. And all of those things are totally reasonable. And hopefully, if you listen to last week's episode, when you think about your preparation, you do have all of those answers ready for the person. If you are the person on the receiving end of a layoff conversation, then these are all questions that you should ask. And a lot of questions that come up in, as we know, if you've ever had to terminate someone, is why am I being terminated? Did I do something wrong? How long is my severance? How long is my healthcare going to last? Like all of those questions and all of those concerns come up. And again, ideally, if something is performance related, people already see it coming because you've been transparent and honest and forthcoming, and the manager has done the same. But in the event that that doesn't happen, which hopefully is seldom, all of those questions need to be answered by the person delivering this news. And, I think when we think about the steps that follow answers to those questions, if someone is laid off, they absolutely must review their separation agreement. Now, with separation agreements, depending on someone's age and where they live, the time to review could look a little bit different. And Dan and I talked about this. So you'll hear this a little bit, actually quite a bit, I should say, in next week's episode as well. But when you're over the age of 40, you do have 3 weeks minimum to review in most places, not most places, everywhere, except some places provide you longer amounts of time. Sometimes that's company policy, but also if it's a group termination, this is really what I'm trying to say. If it's a group termination or a mass layoff, then you have a longer period of time. It's like 45 days, I think. But if it's an individual termination, you don't necessarily get that amount of time. But certainly this is where you'll hear from Dan next week that advocating for yourself and standing up for yourself is number one. If you need more time to review, if you want a greater severance package, those are things you should ask for and negotiate. Certainly when someone is being laid off, they would file for unemployment in the United States, at least. I can't really speak to other parts of the world because I don't have that exact experience, but maybe it's somewhat similar. Certainly you can ask, and this is where I highly and strongly suggest this, you ask for healthcare continuation before needing to pay for COBRA as an individual. COBRA is the continuation of benefits. And basically it takes you would be able to continue your healthcare or your health benefits, but it would be 100% employee paid. In most cases, employees who are laid off can negotiate the continuation of the employer paid portion of healthcare benefits. Certainly if you are due a bonus and things like that, you can negotiate the timing around that. You can negotiate pretty much everything within a separation agreement and severance package. So again, this is something that we'll dive into in the episode with Dan, so I won't do too much on that subject. But to me, everything is negotiable. And then finally, you probably also want to make sure that you think about how or what approach you're going to take for the next job. Now, it's standard practice, I would say, that companies in general won't share or disclose the reason for someone's end of employment. So if you were to go to a new company and they do an employment verification, they ask your last company, what was the end? Like, why did this person leave? Typically, companies won't disclose that information. I would suggest that you confirm that at the time of a layoff if you are impacted or if you have been impacted by a layoff before. Maybe this is something that you've experienced. But I would say, at least in my experience, 99% of the time, companies don't even want to touch that because a former employee could claim that they were the reason they didn't get new employment. So typically companies just won't even go there, and they'll just say, that's their end date and we're not able to disclose the reasons behind that. So I think the biggest thing that tends to come up when someone's laid off is like, what's next? And I think it's totally reasonable. And we heard from Jenna Dune earlier in this layoff series a couple of weeks ago that the off placement or offboarding of an employee when they are experiencing a layoff or they are terminated is a really helpful benefit, I guess we can call it, perk, or part of the experience for people who are experiencing a layoff, because then they have those outplacement services that support them as they navigate the kind of this like new normal. And something I work with a lot of clients on their resumes, of course, and their LinkedIns and interviews and career coaching and all that jazz. And a lot of the times I'm meeting with people who were unfortunately laid off, or they're not happy with their experience and they feel like this sense of desperation to find something new. That is generally the worst time to start looking at your resume and your interview skills. Like, you really want to work with someone like me or work with someone else before a circumstance like this so that you are just prepared and ready to go. Like, I should probably take my own advice. I haven't looked at my resume in years, but I could, right? Like, even though I have no reason to leave, I'm not looking to leave, I don't believe I'm going to be fired at any point, knock on wood. It's always good to have those documents like kind of fresh and updated, maybe every 6 months or so, at least once a year. And so if you are hearing this message and you feel the same as me, you're not looking to go anywhere, but you also don't think that you're going to be fired, like, this is probably a good reminder to look at your resume. And if you need help with that, you can always come to me too. In general, it's probably just a good idea to freshen those things up. Same with LinkedIn, because also you just never know if someone, looks at your LinkedIn and they want to see what you're up to. And if it's outdated, that doesn't really help you potentially advance if that's what you're looking for. And not finally, but another thing that is a good consideration to have, and hopefully none of you are ever laid off, but if 40% of Americans experience this, then almost 50% of us are going to have this situation at some point or feel this impact at some point. Definitely make sure you gather all of the things that you need, like your performance reviews. If there's anything that you've worked on that's your intellectual property, although the caveat there is that sometimes we sign offer letters that also absolve us of claiming ownership on things that we've created. So make sure you're really clear on that, because you do not want to encroach on a territory where you have then taken things that actually belong to a company and then they sue you. You don't want that. So make sure that if you feel it's your intellectual property, that you don't have an intellectual property agreement that you've signed, because if you do have something that you've signed around intellectual property, chances are that's not actually your intellectual property anymore. So just a word to the wise, keep that in mind. And then also, think about who you might want to stay in contact with, like people who you have good relationships with, maybe even your manager. You can always ask for a reference. Not every company offers or provides references, because sometimes it's like a conflict. And I found it's like 50-50 in the companies I've worked for. Some companies, when they're more established, are like, nope, we don't offer any professional references. And some companies just simply do not care. And you can provide a professional reference or receive a professional reference, but make sure you ask. And then, of course, anything that you need related to your termination, you would want also. Now, I realize that many of you are in HR and you already know the documents that you need when it comes to, leaving a company, but still sometimes I think in the heat of the moment and as things are going on, all of that goes out the window, because now you're not the one delivering the message, you're the one receiving it. And then finally, in terms of preparation, you also want to make sure that you know if there's any financial assistance that's provided, whether it's an emergency fund, benefits cash out options, expense reductions, again, coming back to healthcare, all of that. And there actually is a link to an article from NerdWallet that we'll link in the show notes. And it's about like different steps that you can take to get support financially if that happens. So I'll provide that. And then, finally, I think we've talked about this before on the podcast, that our jobs often are part of our identities. Like, I know I conflate my identity with my career all the time, and I'm honestly okay with that. I have a podcast and everything that I do is HR Traci. Like, that's just kind of how I live, and that's okay with me. But I think when layoffs happen, it's extremely deflating, and it has an impact on our ego and our pride and our sense of self. And so I realize it's easy for me to say, but I would really recommend that you try not to have those feelings. And again, very easy to say. But when we have those feelings, we are conflating our identities with our careers, when actually, if we're working for someone else, I think the exception is if you have your own business, but you're not going to lay yourself off. But in the event that you work for someone else and you don't have your own business, you're an employee. Like, your career can be totally separate from the place in which you work. Like, you can be an HR professional regardless of whether you work at Chase, Target, or a mom and pop boutique, right? The key there is that you take your career and all the things with you, and the person or the company that you work for is just where you kind of hang your hat. And so your ability to do a good job as a practitioner is not solely based on whether you're employed or not. But again, easy for me to say. I realize that. But I certainly encourage any of you who maybe are experiencing this now, or who unfortunately may experience this in the future, that you take the time to really feel and process the layoff, but disallow the conflation of that layoff being a reflection of you and your ability to be successful. Of course, even in performance-related terminations, there's still, I think, a real reason to feel that, because, and something that Dan mentions on the podcast next week is this like sense of subjectivity around terminations, especially performance related ones. And I don't totally disagree. I think, performance is something different to everyone, and good performance and bad performance is sometimes subjective, unless, it's specific to a very specific goal. So all of that to say is, be positive. There's a job out there for everyone. I believe every pot has its lid, and it's just a matter of finding that right place. And, just as we learned when we were kids, when you get knocked down, you just have to get right back up and keep going. So I hope that this is like an episode that no one ever needs to really like leverage or use or rely on. But I also hope that if you are in this situation, or you find yourself in this situation, that it's helpful in some way to you. So all of the articles that I referenced and all of the links that I kind of talked about will be in the show notes, so you can kind of do your own digging and read a little bit more. But, sometimes it can be really difficult if we are the ones, like the practitioners, kind of executing or driving forward either a goal or a termination or like something for the business, and then it's kind of turned on us, and then we're the ones experiencing it. That's probably very difficult, and I hope I never have to experience that too. But if Forbes is right, and 40% of Americans experience a layoff throughout their careers, like, that's tough. Then that might be something that we all have to, one day be prepared for. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you again for listening to this episode. And don't forget, next week is the last episode of the Layoff series with Dan Goodman. And I'm really excited for you to hear all of his thoughts. Thank you so much. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.